Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from Sundy Best, titled Bring Up the Sun. You know, it's been almost 6 months since I made my special comments surrounding the evolving climate in country music, and where I made a plea to mainstream critics on YouTube and otherwise that country music should be afforded at least a little bit more critical coverage, at least more people besides me. And for the most part, this has happened to some extent. Rolling Stone, the AV Club, and even Pitchfork have broadened their horizons slightly and have covered slightly more country music, typically whenever it brushes against either the pop or alternative spectra. You know what, it's better than nothing. And yet, at this current time, I'm still the only guy reviewing country music in this way on YouTube, and honestly, I don't get it. Sure, it's a format that tends to cater to an older audience that might not be as web savvy, and sure, it might have limited cultural force outside of the US, and sure, people my age who are listening to country right now are probably haven't got all that invested within the genre, considering they consider it just a phase or just a craze they want to get into. But still, it's a little jarring and it's a little lonely to see between all the coverage that hip-hop, rock, pop, or even metal gets, it's still just me on YouTube covering country music. But then again, if it's just me talking, I've got a certain obligation to deliver not just quality reviews, but information and news about country acts of which you probably haven't heard of, most of which I discover mostly thanks to tips and by accident. I get annoyed with the lack of country music's web presence in comparison with other genres rather frequently, but the biggest contributing factor to my frustration here is that there isn't an aggregating source. The coverage of alternative or indie country is just so thin in comparison with other genres that it can be a real challenge to track down new starting acts, especially if they don't get mainstream radio airplay. And with the increased conglomerization of radio stations beneath single banners, a lot of local scenes are going to end up getting lost in the shuffle, especially if you don't know where to look for it. This takes us to Sundy Best, a Kentucky-based act that I never would have known had existed if it wasn't for a tip and frequent request in one of my comments. Primarily an acoustic country duo that called back to the earlier days of 70s singer-songwriters, they released their first album, Door Without a Screen, in 2012. That turned out surprisingly strong, with a lot of folk-inspired exuberance fused with fast-picked banjo and pretty clever songwriting. Now, I won't say the album is without its flaws. The production has a strange lack of homegrown grit and does sound a little bit like it was produced in a living room, and the lack of texture was a little bit perplexing, and I didn't think all the lyrics were all that stellar, but they did have a melodic focus and a ton of energy, so I was interested in their sophomore album, Bring Up the Sun, which came out a few weeks ago. How'd it turn out? Well, it's great. In fact, I'm pleased to report that I could add Sundy Best to Jason Eady, Lydia Lovelace, and Eric Posley in the list of great country musicians that I've been introduced to this year. And their newest album, Bring Up the Sun, is definitely a very solid improvement over their debut. And while it does still have its issues and nitpicks, it brings a very unique sound to the country scene that I found really creative and a whole lot of fun, and one that I will definitely recommend to you all here today. So, okay, how the hell did they pull this off? Well, let's first start with the instrumentation and the production, where the most notable changes will have occurred. The first thing you'll notice, for instance, is that there's no drums on this album. At all. Instead, Sundy Best opts to go with the cajon entirely for percussion purposes. And the shocking thing is how well it works. And the other shocking thing is that the songs don't feel top heavy in the mix, mostly because Sundy Best were forced to get creative when it came to adding some presence and power in their mix, particularly near the bottom. And they did it by bringing in rougher electric guitars that sizzle and surge at the very back of the mix, never quite overwhelming thing. And better still, these guitars also contribute to the harmony lines of the songs, driven by the acoustic instrumentation, which are much stronger and a lot better syncopated than on their previous record. In fact, if we were going to look for the unsung hero of this album, it'd probably be in the production, which brings a fair amount of earthy grit and balance, to say nothing of power. And as much as I like the bluegrass and folk elements of Door Without a Scream, the production always felt claustrophobic to me on that album. And while this album is much closer to country and 70s roots rock, especially with the addition of the organ, which just wins major points with me right out of the gate, this is a much more natural fit for the band, and the production bellies that. So okay, Let's move on to the vocals, where again we have some improvements. Nick Jamerson's vocal delivery has always been exuberant, but here we actually get a little bit more maturity and weight to his vocal delivery, which is a tempering factor that was desperately needed. I still feel his vocals can be a little bit broad for my taste. He's heartfelt, and that does make up for a lot, but he's not exactly a subtle singer when it comes to delivering those smaller emotions. But you know what? A lot of that comes with time, and comes with more experience, and he still steps up to the microphone with a lot of raw intensity. That works for me, and you can't fake that. And now this takes us to the lyrics and themes, and this is where Sundy Best surprised me the most. And not only because the technical songwriting measurably improved, but that the band diversified their subject matter in a pretty satisfying way. Smoking Gun, for instance. It's a song about admitting you screwed up in the past and that you're accepting the blame, you're taking responsibility, but also that you shouldn't only judge someone based upon their history and that their present actions today, that's irrelevant too. Now, and then you take the song These Days, which is a song about feeling lonely when the majority of your friends get into relationships and you don't. And as much as you end up walking your own path, you can still end up getting hurt through no fault of your own. And then you have Mean Old Woman, which is a straight up murder ballad that brought to my mind images of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And while this particular story takes a very different arc to that classic, it's still as lurid, bloody, and uncompromisingly awesome as that story was. Probably my favorite song on the album by a mile. And yet, this album actually goes deeper than that, thematically exploring a very real dichotomy in the human psyche, particularly the male psyche, the desire to mature and settle down and find that true expression of love, and the instinct to run wild and have fun, holding it together however long as you possibly can. And while Jason Eady's Daylight and Dark went pitch black in its exploration of all the benefits and costs to walking on the darker side, Sundy Best opts to keep things a little bit more lighter and more love-struck. Until I Met You, Lot of Love, Wild One, and Thunder are all songs that cheer for the more mature side of the argument and settling down with that special someone. And while Beautiful Mess and Swarpin' do make a pretty compelling case for haphazard living, they do feel a little bit undercut and not quite as well framed. And I would be remiss to mention the worst song on the album, Noia, which seems to be Sundy Best's attempt to jump onto the bro country bandwagon. And while the song is somewhat self-aware, and that is a redeeming factor, the tone is still a little bit too sour and the lyrics a little bit too leering to really save the song. And on that note, while I can't say I Want to Go Home or Lily are bad songs by any stretch, both of them are actually quite good, and Lily's a great song, I do question the reasoning to include either of them on this album, even though they do have new arrangements from their placement on their debut album. But look, in the end, you still get the impression that Sundy Best are opting for the settling down option in the end. That's what they want to do, which makes the final song, Painted Blue, such an emotional gut punch that really does feel earned. How he worked so hard to figure out his issues and change and grow and mature, and then he got left behind by the girl for which he did it all because of his sordid history and everything he did in his past. And as he regresses in the song back to the cigarettes and the whiskey and the hard living and trying to isolate himself from the pain he's going through, there's a very subtle realization that if he wants to change, he's gonna have to do it for himself, not do it for somebody else, and it will definitely be a struggle. And that lends the song a powerhouse of weight that just makes it a brilliant thesis for the end of the album. So yeah, in the end, Bring Up the Sun is a great, unconventional, impressively bold country album that calls back to the past and yet innovates enough to sound very unique today. I'll admit that there are plenty of songs that just struck a real unique chord with me, and I will just have to listen all together. Hell, this album has a murder ballad. It wins points with me there. But that does not make this album any less well-written, melodically driven, or emotionally powerful. It's an 8 out of 10 for me and a very high recommendation. And you know what? If I'm the only guy on YouTube who's talking about or criticizing country music, well, I might as well find some damn great albums for the trouble and make sure you guys all know about them too. So check out Bring Up the Sun by Sundy Best. You will not regret it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums that you'd like me to cover coming up this year, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. So until then, I'm Mark, and I'll see you next time.